Psalm 145. A joy as we are now this week and next week doing the concluding 6 Psalms to bring together our study of the Psalm Project. And I'm really honored that we have Harold Levine with us, in that the Song Project for me began in part to his rabbi, his partner in teaching Psalms, and that is Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum. Rabbi Kleinbaum and I went together as part of a cohort of the American Jewish World Service about 4 or 5 years ago to the Dominican Republic to explore human rights. And our daughter, Joey's sister, Anna, and now her fiance, Liv, have been going to services at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah, the congregation in New York City that, as Harold reminded us, is the largest gay, lesbian, LGBTQ congregation, with many others, straight, all kinds. It's a synagogue of diversity. And our daughter, Anna, sent me, when COVID first began, the newsletter from the congregation in which Rabbi Kleinbaum was beginning to teach Psalms and introducing it as what Jews do when there is crisis. And that was part of my trigger for saying, oh, that's such a great idea. I'm going to do that too. And Harold, we've been doing it here since March, 3 times a week, a half-hour psalm. Today, Psalm 145. So again, thank Rabbi Kleinbaum for being part of my catalyst and for you to share and honor your congregation, as we also honor my son, Joey, with his birthday. Now, I've referred to Psalms as the Jewish people's playlist. These are the poems, the songs that we as a community have sung to God in the beginning of pandemics, in times of distress. It's our go-to. And of all those 150 Psalms, the most sung of all is today, Psalm 145. Another inspiration for my teaching of Psalms was Rabbi Dr. David Lieber, the general editor of the Eitz Chaim Chumash, the Chumash that we use in our synagogue. And I once said to Dr. Lieber, my teacher and my mentor, I said to him, what is your favorite psalm, after he told me that he loves the Psalms? And he said, Psalm 145, today's psalm. So in honor of Joey, he's not just getting any psalm, he's getting not only the most played song, but he's another catalyst, the beloved song of my teacher, David Lieber. One other important teacher who may join us, and that's Jack Reamer, who has been in and out and joining our class. He sent me an address that he presented to the Canners Assembly Convention, sharing why Psalm 145 is the most popularly sung song. And I'm going to circle back to that great teaching of Rabbi Reamer. But before I do, to lay out our format, each of the Psalms that we share is a translation that I've worked on, looking at 10 or more other translations and commentaries. So I want to read first the Psalm together. And again, it's a Psalm familiar to all of us. When Joey was a bar mitzvah and preparing to be a bar mitzvah, he sang, Ashrei Yoshvei Veitecha, Od Yolucha Sela. And that's how we got our bar and bat mitzvahs to participate. And we did it responsively. This is a psalm that has a long history of being sung responsively. And I'll come back to the Dead Sea Scrolls and how they had a responsive in the Dead Sea Scrolls, written during the time of the end of the Second Temple. After every verse in their version, they would sing, Baruch Adonai, blessed is the ever-present one, Baruch Shemo, blessed is his name, Leolam Va'ed, forever. So that every line was chanted as if and it might have been on the Temple Mount. The Levites chanted a verse of Psalm 145, and then there would be a response, a call and refrain. And that is still how I identify Ashrei. So back to the text and the layout. When we chant it as a prayer, there are 3 added verses that are not Psalm 145. Psalm 145 begins with Tehillah LeDavid, a psalm for David. By the way, this word Tehillah, a psalm for David, the word Tehillah only appears here. The rabbis would decide that these 150 poems that they collected would be called Tehillim, songs of praise. But the only word of introduction of all these psalms that has this praise for David or by David is Psalm 145. The rabbis in the Talmud, and we'll get to this in a moment in Brachot 4b, would say that anybody who says Psalm 145 3 times a day will have a place in the world to come. And toward that end, the word Ashrei would be the name of the psalm that we popularly use, but it's an addition of 3 Ashreis at the very beginning, one in Psalm 84:6, then twice in Psalm 114:15, to sort of speaking by the medieval times, when it was customary to say this psalm twice in the morning as part of morning prayers and as the opening of the afternoon prayers. So Ashrei was mentioned 3 times, almost as a reminder of this promise. If you say this prayer 3 times, this Psalm 145, you will have a place in the world to come, which leads to the question, why of all the Psalms is that promise made for this psalm? Why is this psalm said 3 times a day? So now some thoughts to look for as we read the psalm. We're going to begin with Tehillah LeDavid, not those introductory verses. And in doing so, there is a move in the psalm that can be understood in 2 ways. The first way was already identified by the Maharal, who lived in Prague in the 16th century. The first way to understand it in terms of structure was Eliezer of Worms, in which he would say, writing along the Rhine River, he would say 1160 to 1235, Eliezer of Worms, of those places, those Jewish communities along the Rhine called Shum. He would say there's a move here literarily from I, and that's how the psalm begins, to verse 10, when it's you're faithful, and then a shift to the universal. So that's one thing to be aware of. There's this progression from I, praising God, you're faithful, and then all of creation. Now circle the word all. It will appear 17 times in this psalm. Over and over, the word all. And all will refer to kol ma'asecha, all your doings, to all of time, b'chol dor v'dor, from all generation to generation. And so all listen for it and watch how it's used repeatedly as an important motif. The other thing to look for is the constant synonyms for both praising God, but even more, this is a psalm about the need to proclaim, to tell from generation to generation about God. And so look for all and listen for all the synonyms. This is a psalm about telling God's praise to other people so that they will sing. But what is particularly dramatic, and I'm going to give away Rabbi Reimer's punchline in part, and that is, as Rabbi Reimer wrote of this psalm, I love this, I love Rabbi Reimer, and I love his line. Ashrei declares that the world is not our mother. The earth is our sister. It is our task to join with our sister and sing out the praise of God for having made us both. So this is the most universal of psalms, in which kol ma'asecha, all of God's creation, is to sing out to God. And one more line from my teacher and friend, Rabbi Jack Reimer. He was the secretary for, when he was a rabbinical school student at JTS, he was Abraham Joshua Heschel's secretary. And he came upon a line as he was editing some of Heschel's writing, and which Heschel wrote that one should see oneself as the cantor of the universe. And he said to him, what does it mean to be a cantor of the universe? And his teacher said to him, my friend, have you never read Psalm 145? And he then said, I went back to my dorm room and I reread it. And indeed, this is a psalm in which we are called to be cantors, prayer leaders, for the song of praise by the entire universe. So listen for that universality that is distinctive to Psalm 145. And again, we'll circle back to, why is this the most sung psalm? Last, in terms of structure, this psalm is divided into parts. An introductory prelude, verses 1 and 2, that will lead to a description of God's greatness, verses 3 to 6. And then God's goodness, verses 7 and 9, with 10 as the interlude, the bridge. Verses 11 and 13, praising God as King of Kings. And then the longest part, verses 14 to 20, descriptions of God's beneficence, with the concluding line coming full circle. Praise, Tehillat Adonai, what began with Tehillat LeDavid, praise of David, ends with praise of God, with the same two other words, Vayvarech, bless, Leolam Va'ed, forever. And so with that, the Psalm 145, and I'll say as I begin, I already made a change in my translation this morning than what you would have received in advance, in that the opening, Aromimcha, can be, let me exalt you, let me bless you. And I changed it, as some of the translations also have, to I will exalt you. Because as I sat with this poem, the sense of loyalty and confidence of the Psalter comes through, with but only a hint in verses 19 and 20 of trouble. Opening your hand and satisfying every living being. A Psalm of David. I will exalt you. my God the sovereign, and I will bless your name forever and ever. Every day I will bless you, and I will praise your name forever and ever. Great is Adonai and much praised. God's greatness is not fathomable. Generation to generation will extol your doings, and of your mighty acts they will tell. Splendor of your glorious majesty and declarations of your wonders I will converse. And of the strength of your wonders they shall speak, and of your greatness I will recount. Remembrance of your abundant goodness they shall pour out, and of your righteousness they shall sing joyfully. Gracious and merciful is Adonai, slow to anger and of great kindness. Good is Adonai to all, and God's mercies are over all God's doings. They shall exclaim, Adonai, all your doings, and your faithful will bless you. Of the glory of your sovereignty they will speak, and of your might they will declare, to make known to the offspring of mortals God's mighty acts and the glorious majesty of God's sovereignty. Your sovereignty is a sovereignty kol olamim, of all times, and your reign b'chol dor v'dor is for each generation to generation. Supportive is Adonai for all fallen, and raises up all the bent. Eyes of all wait hopefully for you, and you give them their food in its proper time. Poteach et yadecha, opening your hand, umasbia lechol chai ratzon, and satisfying every living being with favor. Righteous is Adonai in all God's ways, and kind in all God's doings. Near is Adonai to all those who call upon God, for all who call upon God in truth. Favor for those who revere God, God shall do. And their outcry, God will hear and deliver them. Guardian is Adonai to all those that love God, but all the wicked God will destroy. Tehillat Adonai yedaber pi, praise of Adonai my mouth will declare. Vayvarech kol basar shem kodsho leolam va'ed, and let all flesh bless God's holy name forever and ever. And so this is the most universal of the Psalms. But let me go back to the opening question. Why is this the most sung of all Psalms? And in part, the reason is a conversation that takes place in the Talmud, in Brachot 4b. In the early centuries of the Common Era, Rabbi Elazar will quote Rabbi Avina, and he will say, and I will add, this is in the Gemara to the opening Mishnah of all of Brachot. So Brachot, the tractate that deals with prayer, with blessings, will open with, when do we say the Shema at night? And that will lead to a number of tangents. And one of those tangents will be the question of pausing between the final blessing of the Shema and the beginning of the Amidah. The final blessing of the Shema deals with Geula, redemption. Baruch atah Adonai Ga'al Yisrael, praised are you ever-present one who redeems Israel. And that leads into the Amidah. And the question is that a pause? And Rabbi Yochanan will say that to acknowledge God as Redeemer and to link that with the prayer, meaning the Amidah, enables the world to come. And that leads to this free association, in which Ravina is quoted as saying, on a related tangent, Kol ha'omer tehillah David, all who say, the opening two words here, a praise of David. And once again, this title, Tehillah David, only occurs here in Psalm 145. B'chol yom shalosh pamim, 3 times each day, muftach lo, it is promised to him, Shuhu ben ha'olam haba, that he is a child of the world to come. And is the nature of the Talmud, they'll then say, my Tama, what is the reasoning? Is it because it's an acrostic? Because this is an alphabetical psalm. If so, Psalm 119 is a much more developed acrostic, 8 verses for every letter. Is it because it has in it the line acknowledging that God, verse 16, opens God's hand to feed? Well, Psalm 136, called Hallel Hagadol, will say, Noten lechem l'chol basar. God gives bread to every flesh. Ki le'olam chasto. And then the Talmud will say, Eile meshum de'et be tarte. This is because yesh bo shnehem. This is the only one that has both of those. It's both an acrostic, and it's the only acrostic that acknowledges that God opens God's hand. So that seems to be where the conversation kind of ends. It'll deal with why the nun is the one letter missing, which is between 13 and 14. And I'll come back to that little discussion in the Talmud too. So that's answer one. Answer one is, this is an acrostic. And it's an acrostic that uniquely acknowledges God as the giver. Hence, this gives us, this quality of praise, room to be invited into the world to come. Now back to my teacher, Jack Reamer. Jack says, what is distinctive about this psalm is its universality. It is not just the Jews. It is not just the righteous. It is not just people. This is a psalm that has the whole of creation praising the Creator. And that quality of praising God is the culmination on some level, or the embodiment of what it means to praise God. And interestingly, Maimonides will write in the Mishnah Torah, Hilchot Tefillah, his Laws of Prayer 7:12, that Psalms 145 to 150 represent the essence of praising God. And so what Jack says is, with the emphasis here on kol, all, time, all, space, all, is a quality of a crescendo. And that is why it is the psalm chosen. He, being the master pulpit rabbi that he is, he links it to something that was in the news recently. And that is the Leonardo da Vinci painting called the Salvator Mundi. So a word on that. Let me pause to see if Jack is with us. Is Jack with us today? No. Okay. So Salvator Mundi is this small little painting. It's only 26 inches by 19 inches. In 2005, the painting sold at auction for $10,000. And it was entitled in 2005 after Leonardo da Vinci. But there were many art historians who believed that this was an authentic Leonardo. And 10 years later, in 2015, actually it was in November of 2017, 12 years later, this painting, cleaned up, restored, painting had been removed, had been painted over in parts, was sold for $450 million. It's the most money ever paid for a painting. And when Christie's auctioned it off, and it was then to an anonymous buyer that we now known is the Crown Prince, is the head of Abu Dhabi, Mohammed bin Salman, for the Louvre in Abu Dhabi, for which he purchased it, paid $400 million for the painting, and an extra $50 million in expenses to Christie's and stuff. When it was on the market, Christie's, to protect itself, had a clause saying that they were not verifying that this was a genuine Leonardo, because the art historians were still in debate. There was a significant number of art historians who believed it was Leonardo's hand, others who said it was by his students. And there were at least 30 copies that floated around by students of Leonardo. And some said this was the students, and some said it was just an imitation. And so when Christie's sold it, they had this escape clause that they were not validating it. And here was our teacher and friend, Rabbi Reimer's point, that it was only worth $450 million versus 10,000 because of who the painter was. For Leonardo, one of the rare Leonardos, the last of the newfound Leonardos to be put back on the market. And he says regarding the psalmist, that if you look at the world and like this psalmist, you see the work of creation as God's hand, as God's creation, then you see the world differently than the person who sees the world as not having a creator, or it simply having unfolded. To see the world as God's world, God's artwork, however you understand it, and he emphasized in his address to Canners, you can see evolution as the language of God, as God's paintbrush. But if you see the world as unfolding with God's consciousness, as all existing within God consciousness, then it is infinitely valuable. Then the world takes on purpose and meaning that's worthy of song and celebration. And it's that mindset that he says is the mindset of Ashrei, and why Ashrei is universal, and therefore why it's what we sing over and over and over each day. I love that description of the emphasis on the kol makom, the universality of place and time that Psalm 145 distinctly contains and is distilled as tehillah, as praise. Though I will add and build on Rabbi Reimer with another explanation, an additional expansion. And then I'll look at a couple of verses and pull this together. And I have to look at the nun. So we're going about 5 minutes to 10 minutes over because it's such a big and important psalm. And that is, I learned as a rabbi that what people remember is how they feel at the end of a sermon. They remember that more than anything really said, and it paints how they felt about the sermon. How did you feel at the end? Psalm 144 is in many ways the end of the Psalms. It's included in this psalm, Psalm 144:15, in which we acknowledge that double Ashrei, Ashrei Ha'am, happy is the people, which provides the close to Ashrei Ha'ish of Psalm 1. That, as we saw when we looked at Psalm 144, is the way many Bible scholars understand the end of Psalms, and this is the closing block. This collection of 6 Psalms, 145 to 150, will end with a crescendo of hallelujahs, which explains why there is the added verse of Psalm 115:18 to Psalm 145. And that is, V'nachnu nevarech Yah, and we will bless God. Hallelujah. It's going to point to these final hallelujahs. But Psalm 145 is the doorway. It's the liminal process. In many ways, it sums up everything that came before and foreshadows the closing celebration identified with musical instruments and orchestras, and then even the very breath. And what it says is everything is about praise of God. God gave us a purpose, created us as an expression of God's love to love God in return. That's the Brit. That's the covenant. We are here to be God's cantor, to sing out praise to God, to express gratitude. But praise is even more than gratitude. Praise is wonder. Praise is wow. Gratitude is what God did for me. That's important. But praise is even more. Praise is to say, wow, what a world that we're privileged to live in. And to know that there is a loving presence, a consciousness that resonates within all, that allows our own love to flow through us as consciousness. And Psalm 145 is that bridge between Psalm 1 to 144 and the closing hallelujahs. We repeat it over and over precisely because it is the reminder of Tehillah, of the need and the privilege of praise. And now to build again on Rabbi Reamer, to do so as the cantor for the universe. To be a cantor for the universe is to say, I am grounded in belonging. This psalm, as he points out, does not mention Zion, does not mention a moment in Jewish history, does not mention priests. This is a psalm that is transcendent, and yet at the same time was chanted on the Temple Mount. This is the psalm that people would sing together, call and refrain, as a culmination of both identity and purpose. Identity of belonging to a Jewish people and a sense of purpose that we are the cantor for the cosmos. Pretty big order. And the mystics will pick up on that in terms of all the imagery of how we are the ones who heal the world. And so now 2 quick verses, a comment on Nun, and I thank you for going a little longer. These 2 verses. First is the justification, verse 16. Poteach et yedecha, we say of God, you open your hand and satisfy every living being with favor. There's a Sephardic custom of opening one's hand when one says verse 16. That's been widely adapted just in recent decades by Ashkenazim. The Ashkenazic tradition in saying verse 16 is opening your hand. We touch the hand, our finger, to our tefillin on the hand, and then every living being we touch our rosh, the head. The Zohar will say, opens your hand and satisfies every living being with favor. B'chol chai ratzon, l'chol chai ratzon. The Zohar will say in Pinchas that what does that mean? That God opens the hand and gives the ability to be satisfied, meaning or having a desire for all of life. There's also a messianic dimension. And back to Rabbi Yochanan and the link in 4b. And the link is, this has this messianic dimension. And in that regard, honoring my son, Joey, on today, the joy of being a parent for the first time was for Linda and me with Joey. Verse 9. Good is Adonai to all, and God's mercies over all God's doings. This verse 9 will be used as a call. Rabbi David Kimchi in the Middle Ages will say that as God is good to all God's creatures, so we have a responsibility to be good to all living things. And in learning this verse, I learned an interesting law. The Ramah, the important teacher of Ashkenaz, 16th century, commenting on the Shulchan Aruch, would say, why is there no Shehecheyanu, that blessing said when doing something for the first time, when a shochet does the first shechita? Why isn't he celebrating this newfound skill? And the answer is, we do not say the Shehecheyanu with shechita because it's taking the life of a living thing and then echoing this verse, God is merciful to all God's doings. And behind that is a story in the Talmud in Baba Metzia 85a. And I mention this because Joey is a vegetarian with a sensitivity to living things. Rabbi Yehuda HaNasi, the great rabbi who would edit the Mishnah, saw a calf bound for market, frightened. And Yehuda HaNasi, seeing the fear in the eyes of the calf, said, go, for this you were created. And the judges in heaven, the angels, seeing his insensitivity to the fear, the pain of the calf, said, because of your lack of mercy, you will suffer. And then the Talmud will say for 13 years he struggled with bodily afflictions that would end in one fell swoop. Literally, when his maid was seeking to sweep up a mice nest, and he said to his maid, stop, let the mice be. And when the angels in heaven saw his mercy for every living creature, his own suffering was removed. And so, verse 10, God, good is Adonai to all, and God's mercies over all God's doings. And the closing question, why is there not a nun? There is no nun according to the Talmud in that same sugya in 4bet, because there is a verse in Amos. And that verse in Amos will begin with a nun, and it will say, no fail, that Israel has fallen and will not get up. And that David, in his prophetic, could read ahead, Nafla, lo tosif kum. She has fallen and will not get up again, Batulat Yisrael, the maiden of Israel. And therefore not in this positive flow did not have a nun. But David, in his prophetic abilities, later commentate will say in the Talmud, said, Somech Adonai lechal hanoflim, supportive as Adonai for all fallen. Now, in the Dead Sea Scroll, also in the Septuagint, there is a verse. And here's what the verse is for the Nun. Ne'eman Elohim, God is trustworthy, bidvarav, in his words, v'chasid b'chol ma'asav, and kind in all his doings. Robert Alter, who I often go back to, will say this is a scribal error. It was there, and it fell off. Literally, nafal. But other modern Bible scholars would say, no, we don't agree. Reuven Kimmelman, the great professor of Jewish studies at Brandeis University, would say, two things make this addition suspect. One, it sounds a lot like Tzaddik Adonai b'chol rechav, v'chasid b'chol masav. It's the only time you'd get a repeating of a phrase. And instead of Adonai in verse 17, to use the word Elohim is suspect. And on both counts, he sees it as an addition. And Benjamin Siegel will point out that there are 9 acrostics. And in 3 other acrostics, which would mean 4, there is a letter missing as a way to point out there's a turning point in the story. Because with Somech, you then have the shift to talking about all that God does, supports, opens, gives food. and therefore says it's purposeful, and that there's a natural tendency to fill in the missing letters in those psalms and in this psalm. And there's even a medieval filling in of this psalm, which Benjamin Siegel points out, in which this there is a verse in a medieval text filling in the nun, but he believes it's purposeful. And so to pull all this together, and now to see Joey and give Joey a closing word for today, and that is Psalm 145 is the most sung of the playlist 3 times a day. Why? Why this psalm? The Talmud will say, may be related to Rabbi Yochanan's comment, that if you link Geula, redemption, and this has a messianic quality, with prayer, the Amidah, and this will be the introduction to the Amidah in Mincha, twice in Shacharit, that brings Geula. The Talmud will say in Barachot 4b, because this psalm uniquely is an acrostic. What's the nature of an acrostic? An acrostic that uniquely mentions that God gives to all and meets all their needs, both spiritual and physical. An acrostic is that which is easily learned because it's alphabetical. An acrostic seems to indicate that all praise, all from A to Z, I wish to convey to you. Add your own, because words are incomplete. But when I do it as an acrostic, it's to say, I wish to say all praise. That's the Talmud's explanation. Rabbi Reamer will add, this is the most universal of psalms, in which we're called to be the cantor of the universe, quoting Rabbi Heschel. And in doing so 3 times a day, we fulfill our greatest mission as God's covenantal people. And I would only add to that, that the reason that this is the all psalm is that as 145, it is all that came before and the crescendo of the hallelujahs that we will be left with. And as this is the door, the passage between the two, when we repeat it, we are encompassing the whole of Tehillah. The rabbis knew that most of these poems were petitionary. The psalmist is in trouble. The psalmist is complaining. It's the whole range of emotions. And yet the rabbis chose to call all of these psalms Tehillim, praise. Not because that's the motif most common among them, but because they understood that that is the goal of poetry to God. And with that, I turn to my son, my Bechor. I put him on the spot. He's a busy man in Portland, Maine, engaged as an entrepreneur with a wonderful startup that will allow all kinds of caregivers to help and partner with their patients more effectively in knowing how their movements could be better attuned. And with that, Joey, one closing thought on 20 years since you chanted the Ashrei, or about the teaching this morning.
Well, first, thank you, Dad. It's really humbling to get this opportunity, and by extension gets to feel like I get to celebrate with each of you on my birthday. Some of you are even at my bar mitzvah. You know, I don't think I have the scholarship to really add much to the conversation on the Ashrei, but one thing that does come to mind just on the theme of birthdays is, you know, my dad, you're 35 years my senior. And one of the things I've been really touched and really impressed by is your initiative in doing this Psalm class, starting in COVID and having the opportunity to take advantage of time and Zoom to pursue a project, not because anyone asked, but because that's what you were curious about and wanting to share those learnings with other people. So my wish, I guess, on my birthday is that when I'm that age and beyond, I share that same thirst for knowledge, and not just for my own sake, but in sharing it with other people.
Mm. I feel blessed each day by you, Joey, and blessed in this moment by your sense of a trajectory in my life and for yourself as blessing, which is to always be learning. And you are indeed a lover of learning. And it makes me so proud of you and for that and in every way. I pause again as I pull together to acknowledge that Rabbi Reamer honored Joey and honored me by being at Joey's bar mitzvah and giving a talk on Friday night at the dinner for family and friends. And that also pulls together Psalm 145 as a Rabbi Reamer teaching. And I want to again acknowledge Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum and Congregation Beit Simchat Torah through Harold Levine, who are a catalyst for this moment. Rabbi Levine, a closing word? Not Rabbi.
Yes. Thank you so much for this teaching. We have gone very slowly so that in our regular class, we're only up to Psalm 25. But this week, we're studying the Psalms of Psuche de Zimra, and tomorrow we are studying Psalm 145. So somehow these two classes crossed this week, and I'm going to be taking back to our class tomorrow so much of the fantastic teaching that you imparted today. What a wonderful community you have here. And isn't it, the Psalms are just an inexhaustible source of inspiration and study. And I am so honored to have been invited to be your guest today. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, Harold. Thank you. Thanks to the community. Invite the community. All the teachings are a portfolio on our website. So they can
I certainly will. We have 200 people on our mailing list, about 70 people who come every day. So I will be sending an email to all of them, connecting them with your archives. And I was texting with Rabbi Kleinbaum while during class, and she said she's sorry she couldn't be here, but she sends her love.
Oh, thank you. I receive it as such as I share my love with my son, Joey. Happy birthday, Joey.